to everyone. This is Habits of the Heart, Rabbinic Perspectives on Human Temperament and Character with Rabbi Alex Israel. This is the 5th session of 8. In this class, examining rabbinic voices on our human traits and dispositions. Topics to be discussed include gratitude, speech and silence, tension and tranquility, materialism, thought versus action, joy and happiness, and finding meaning, with sources from across the spectrum of the rabbinic and philosophical bookshelf. It's been a pleasure to learn with Rabbi Alex Israel these first few weeks, who is a teacher and educator. If you like his work here, you should check out his daily 9 to 9 podcast, the Tanakh podcast. Sources for today's class will be posted in chat on both Zoom and Facebook Live once things get underway. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to speak up or write them in chat. I will bring things to Rabbi Israel's attention on both platforms. And if you are also on Zoom, I can make you a participant, so you can mute yourself, unmute yourself, show your face. If you want to say an attendee, I can still unmute you. Just shoot me a message or wave your hand in chat. The only thing I ask is, if you are not currently speaking, to please mute yourself so that we can avoid any audio crossing the streams. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Israel for some good Torah for the day.
Okay. Welcome to everybody who's listening to the recording or what have you. Delight to be with you. And today we are going to attack a topic which deals with I guess how we can manage our traits, how we can manage our inner world, how our comportment in the world. I really want to deal with, I'll share my screen already and jump into it. I really want to argue, are we in control of everything that happens in our worlds emotionally, or alternatively, our environment controls us, our actions control us. And this is, this is not so much a philosophical, I guess you could argue that the two approaches I'm going to be learning with you today, that one is almost a cognitive approach and the other is a behavioral approach, if I use psychological terms. One is going to be, as you can see from the title, about mind over matter. And the other one is going to be far more about the way our environment and our actions shape us, right? Or I wrote here in the subtitle, is our inner world shaped by our behavior, or do we determine who we are? So I think this is sort of like quite an important thing. A lot of people will say that, our traits aren't so much in our control. And I want to sort of examine that question today. If our traits aren't under our control, then, well, maybe there's not so much point talking about them. I hope that we do have the ability sort of to control our anger, our responses to things, our impulsiveness. Of course, sometimes our nature, our human nature, gets in the way. Sometimes it's not easy to control ourselves. I don't know, eating late at night or something like that. Not always easy. So I want to try and deal with this through two classic sources. And as I said in a previous class, I said that one of the things that I'm trying to do in this course, as with many of the courses I give, is to, how should I say it, to expose all of our participants to classic sources in Jewish thought, almost sources which I feel like educated Jews should know. And that hopefully these sources will, be in your in your mind, so that you can reference them, because these are really, very, very classic in terms of their place in Jewish philosophy. And, there'll be things that you can draw on at other points. So let's begin. We're going to learn two main sources and supplement it with others. And the first main source is from the Ibn Ezra in Shemot. Ibn Ezra actually wrote two Perushim to Shemot, the Perush Aroch and the Perush Katzar. Quite impressive, not only to write one commentary, but actually two on a given book. And this, we're going to talk about the law, you shall not covet. The idea of lo tachmod. And of course, the question of lo tachmod is one of, I guess at a basic level, jealousy, looking at what somebody else is having and saying that you want it. Now, I do have to say, if my neighbor decides to go to, Hawaii for their winter vacation, and I say, oh, I'd love to go to Hawaii for their winter vacation, that is not called lo tachmod. If my neighbor just got a great job and I want to get a great job, that's not lo tachmod. The problem is, especially in an era in which you didn't have, if my neighbor has a wonderful new iPhone and I say, oh, I'd like to get the same model, that's not a problem. The problem becomes when I want to get his iPhone. Now, in today's world where things are manufactured, that's not such a big deal. You just go at, he bought a Ferrari, I'll buy a Ferrari. But the problem was in the ancient world, there was only one of everything. Things were tailor-made. Things didn't come off the factory line. And this is especially true when you're talking about people's homes. And as the Gemara talks about, people's animals. And even as the Torah, sorry, not as the Gemara, as the Torah talks about people's animals. And even more so, people's life partners. So we have the idea of lo tachmod, beit re'echa lo tachmod, eshet re'echa, shoro v'chamoro v'chol asher re'echa, that if somebody sets their eyes on somebody else's wife or husband and tries to wrest that partner away from them, that would be lo tachmod. If somebody says, well, I really like your house, of course, that's a unique property. And then they say, well, I'm going to try and, even though I know you don't want to leave your house, I'm going to try and find a way to get you out of it. That would be lo tachmod. And the question, of course, is, okay, well, the first layer of lo tachmod is actually, having a sort of infatuation about that particular object. Can I control my infatuations? What happens if every time I see that particular, talks about his donkey. Well, I'm not particularly, allured by donkeys, but let's say I looked at his donkey and I said, wow, look at the way it carries a load. Oh, what a stupendous donkey. And therefore I told everybody in the marketplace, he should really sell the donkey to me. And I keep on thinking, I need that donkey. I need that donkey. It's really going to be good for my company. How can I stop myself? I can stop myself from asking him for it, but can I stop wanting it? And that's the way it's phrased. Lo tachmod, you shouldn't desire. So this is where the Ibn Ezra comes in. And he says like this, I've given you the translation. I actually got to be honest, I did not check the translation very much. So I just sort of like pasted it in from a website in a bit of a hurry. So I'll read the Hebrew. I know what that says. I hope the English is relatively good. So he says, Lo tachmod, anashim rabim yitmhu al zot mitzvah. Many people will wonder or will be in surprise at this mitzvah. And we'll say, and here's the question, Eich yihyeh adam shelo yachmod davar yafeh v'libo. How can it be that lo tachmod begins in our emotions? If you see something nice, you want it, right? We're built that way. What do you want me to do? I see, a great meal in a restaurant. I'd like it. I can't afford it, but I like it. So he says, he says, you know what? You can. And let me explain to you. Here's a way of thinking it. He says, Ki ish kafri. Let's say you've got sort of a villager, a peasant, a farm yokel. Sheish lo deya nechona. And this guy, he's got a relatively good head on his shoulders. And one day, this farm boy sees the princess in her carriage going from her castle off to the city, and he sees her, and she's so beautiful. He sees her in a carriage. He says, Lo yachmod ota b'libo sheyishkov imo. He will never really think that he could maybe have an intimate relationship with her. He might think she's pretty. He might think she's beautiful, but he would never think sheyishkov ima. Ki yadas sheze lo yitachem. It's only in the fairy stories that the prince marries Cinderella. Okay, doesn't happen in real life. So he says, like, basically, she is of the aristocracy, you are of the peasantry. Zelo yitachen. It's just not on the books. But, and he says, I'll give you another example. And this simple farm boy won't think that he's like a crazy person. That he should have wings, that he should be able to fly like a bird. I always laugh whenever I teach this Ibn Ezra, because one of my sons, actually my son who is currently in Gaza fighting there for the last several months, when he was a little boy, I think even until he was maybe like 12 or 13, he sometimes used to sit there when we were on a tiyul and he used to say, oof, I really want to have wings. I really want to fly. I wish I was a bird. And he used to get really frustrated about it. But of course, even my son at that age realized that this just wasn't on the cards. So he says there are things that we know that we can't do. We're not going to be able to fly. We're not going to be able to extend beyond our social class, even in a socially mobile age. He says, and now he's going to say one which, sorry, I have to give you a trigger warning at this point because it's a little shocking, the next line. He says, Ka'asher ein adam mitavet lishkav im imo af al pi sheyafa ki hirgilu min orav ladat she'asura. He says, in the same way, here's the third example. He says, the taboo about incest, he says, is not something innate. He says it's actually something which is learnt. We get inculcated from a very, very early age that family members are family members and they are not objects of intimacy. And therefore, however pretty my mother might be, right, or my daughter might be, I will not have any sexual attraction to her, even though she's very beautiful, because I've been conditioned to understand that she is out of, this is just not possible. He's given three examples, one on the basis of class, one on the basis of nature, and third one on the basis of cultural conditioning, as far as he's concerned. By the way, interestingly enough, the Maimonides too, the Rambam as well, also thinks that there is no innate sense that, incest would be something you wouldn't want to do. He says it's just something you learn from society. But he says all of these are things which there's no physical reason why a person shouldn't want to do them. They're lovely things to do, to fly, to marry a princess, sexual attraction, but nobody goes there. And nobody goes there because we all know it's out of bounds. And basically what he's going to then say is, okay, so you see that there is the ability of the mind to rule things out. When I teach this, sometimes I say that, I went to university, I went to the London School of Economics. It was not a Jewish university. There were maybe a couple of hundred Jews on campus with, I don't know, 20,000 students. Okay. So I was in lots of courses with, some lovely, lovely people who were my age and very attractive. I never thought of asking any one of the girls in my class out. Why? I was never attracted to any of them. Why? Because I knew I was never going to marry a non-Jew. I was only going to marry a Jew. And therefore, I never, ever even entertained any sort of relationship with anybody who wasn't Jewish. I don't think I would have entertained a relationship with anybody who wasn't, halakhically observant, because it just wasn't, I've heard people say the same thing about dating somebody who is not going to make aliyah or something like that. Yeah, we set our rules. We set our ground rules. So, I never particularly had an attraction to break Shabbat because that's something which I'm committed to. So what he's saying is that the mind is a funny thing. On a Wednesday, I might pick up my phone 50 times during the day and check my internet and check my social media. But on Shabbat, I feel zero attraction to it. Why? Because I know it's out of bounds. In other words, says the Ibn Ezra, there is mind over matter. And if you make a mental decision that something is not available, it is not available. And therefore he says, Kacha. I'm over here. Kacha. Oops. There you go. Kacha. He says in the same way, Kol maskil tzarich sheida, every intelligent person needs to know, ki shayafa, that just because a woman is beautiful, sorry about the male bias here, or mamon, or somebody else's money, right? I might see some money, I might be at work and I see a pile of money. Lo yinsenu adam ba'avur chokhmato v'da'ato. It's not about you. Rak kasher chalak l'Hashem. It's only if God allows you to have it. If that's not my money, it's not my money, even if it's sitting on the table. Va'amar Kohelet la'asher la'adam shelo amel bo yitnenu chalko. And Kohelet, he quotes Kohelet, that God can give you whatever you want. And the rabbis say, Bani chayu mazone lav bischutei talia milta ele b'mazla, that our ability to have children and the length of our life and our parnasa is not even directed at how much work we put into it, but there's a lot of good fortune and luck involved in that. And then he says, we have to know that whatever God has given us, God has given us, and that's what we have, and something which isn't ours is not ours. And he says, and once we know that God has ruled out having any option of taking my neighbor's wife, it's even more out of bounds than the case of the queen, the princess in the mind of the peasant. So he said, just control. You have to, if you've got a problem of attraction to something forbidden, the problem is not that the attraction is too strong. The problem is with you that your sense of boundaries are too weak. And when a person has a sense of boundaries, that they understand that what is allowed and what is not allowed is not allowed, then there will be no attraction. In other words, our mind is an incredibly strong muscle, and we have the ability to tell ourselves things, right? And we know this is true. I don't know who's on this call, but maybe there's a marathon runner, right? And if you're a marathon runner, you know how to run through the pain, right? And how to run through, when things are hard, and you don't say, well, there's pain, I should stop. You could be able to tell yourself, and this, of course, in a positive direction, that I really want to do this, and I want to run these 42 kilometers, and therefore I am going to, I'm going to do it. And, that's why I've never run a marathon, because I don't have that, I do run regularly, but I've never run more than 10K, and I can't bring myself to run more than it. I can run 10 kilometers and that's about it, because I don't want to. And if I didn't want to run 10K, I wouldn't do that either. It's mind over matter. So this is a very, very interesting. Now, again, notice this is not just about whether I make a decision to go get a job instead of staying in bed, or whether I eat kosher. I made a decision to keep kosher. What he says is this really affects my emotional attractions. And therefore, he's relating here to sexual attractions or other types of attractions, financial attractions. And he says that it's actually within your brain space to really control where you're going. Okay, so this I find quite a fascinating thing, where the Ibn Ezra is insisting that we can be in control. I don't know if anybody has a question or a comment, but now would be a great time, because I'm finished with the first source. I'm going to go on to the second, which is going to take us in a very different direction. Okay, checking the chat. All right, good.
Also all quiet on the Facebook chat.
Okay, fantastic. So let's see. So this is one approach, and I have to say I'm very attracted to this approach, and it's a challenge, and I'd say it's a challenge. It calls us to think to ourselves that when we are having problems with our self-control, I'll give you an example in my life, right? Sometimes I find it hard to get up for shul in the morning, and I'm quite committed to going to shul. But I know that, for example, when it gets to Elul and it gets to Slichot or hearing the shofar in the morning, I have no problem. And it's so interesting. It's the same getting up in the morning. It's the same tiredness and the same lack of sleep. But there's something in my mind that says, I can't miss this. And suddenly I'm there. And if I made that commitment every single morning, I would make sure I got to shul without failing every single day. But there are days where I miss because, clearly my resolve isn't as strong as it should be. So this is a quite important rule. Okay, so let's deal with the second source, which again is another source that I love, and for some of you might have come across it. This comes from the Sefer Chinuch. Just to introduce the Sefer Chinuch. Sefer Chinuch is a book which goes through all the different mitzvot one by one. It was actually written by an author we don't quite know from the school of the Ramban. We're talking about 13th century Spain, around that sort of region, and he says he writes it for his children. Shabbos afternoon, they're a bit bored, and he'll write a book so that he can go through Parsha Shavua according to the different mitzvot. And for each mitzvah, he gives a broad overview. Then he gives the philosophical underpinnings. Then he explains who it applies. Then he explains a few of its halachot, and then he says who it applies to. Does it apply to Israel, outside Israel, to men, to women, to Kohanim, to whatever it might be? Lovely book, Sefer Chinuch, and here he's discussing a law which is to do with the Korban Pesach, shelo lishpor etzem mikol atzmon Pesach. There's a rule that etzem lo tishboru bo, you're not allowed to break a bone in the Pesach. Just say the Pesach was a lamb which was up till a year in age, so it was a very small animal, very young animal, and the bones were very soft. And so one had to cut it very carefully so that one only ate the flesh and one didn't cut a bone or break a bone in the Korban Pesach. It seems like quite an innocuous law. What's it all about? And the Sefer Chinuch is going to try and explain this. Some of you might know this Ramban by its famous tagline. Let me see if I can find it. You'll see I'm highlighting it now. Acharei ha'pu'ulot, oops, came out wrong there. Acharei ha'pu'ulot nishachim al-vavot. Right? The hearts are drawn after the actions. So that's the headline of this chinuch. But let's go and read it together. What the chinuch wants to know, or what he wants to understand, is why. First, we'll deal with the mitzvah itself, but why there are so many mitzvot dealing with dealing with Yetziat Mitzrayim. If you think about it, with Yetziat Mitzrayim, there's umpteen mitzvot. There is the Seder itself, which has, the Korban Pesach, and Chametz, and Matzah, and 7 days, and we've got the rules of the 4 cups of wine, and Maror, and then there's a mezuzah, which is meant to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, and there are Sukkot, which are meant to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, and there are tefillin, which are meant to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, and there's tzitzit, which are meant to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, and Kiddush, we say Zeichel Yetziat Mitzrayim. My goodness, this is a little over the top. I know it's important, but I got the point. Okay, how many more things are you going to pile on me, Zeichel Yetziat Mitzrayim? It's a lot of things. So what's going on? Okay, so that's going to be the question. Why do we need to hack away at something like that? So let's take a look. And let's see. Mishorshei HaMitzvah. Okay, the roots of the mitzvah are Lizkor Nisei Mitzrayim, to remember the miracles of Egypt. Like we've written with all the other mitzvot about Egypt. And he says, and this is another branch out of that root. And now he explains why, and now the English is kicking in. Because it's not respectable. On the night of Pesach, we're meant to be like Bnei Chorin. We're meant to be like free people. And it's not respectable for dignified free people to be sucking at the bones. It's the wretched, miserable poor who have to suck away at bones. But people who are dignified, well-to-do people don't need to suck at the bones of what they're eating. So in other words, what they want us to do, you remember, like in the Seder, we're meant to lean like, Roman nobility. So just like if we're playing for the evening, we're playing being nobility. So, okay, there you go. So we should act that way, not only in our style of leaning, but also not to break open the bones and suck them out. Because we're celebrating becoming the chosen of nations, Mamlechet Kohanim B'Goy Kadosh, Uv'chol Shana V'Shana B'Oto Zman. And on that anniversary every year, Ra'oi Lanu Lasot Masim Hamarim Banu Ha'Ma'ala Gedola Sha'alinu La B'Ota Sha'ah. We should express in our comportment that great level we reached of freedom, of God's children, so to speak. Now, this last phrase is lovely. And when we do actions and we act something out, it makes an impression on our psyche, right? I want you to see that, right? In the act and reenactment that we do, this thing is placed in our souls for eternity, right? I would say it's slightly different with the sort of modern English, but in other words, what he's saying is that when you act something out, it makes an impression on your inner world. And now he says, maybe I'll read the paragraph in English a little bit, and then we'll go back to the Hebrew. My son, don't think to pounce on my words and say, why would God, that may be blessed, command us to do all of these commandments to commemorate the miracle? If there was one commemoration, wouldn't we remember it? Such that it not be forgotten from the mouth of the offspring. You must know that it's not from and he says, you should know that it's not from your wisdom that you question me about this, and it's only because you're so young that leads you to this. So, my son, you're asking me, why do we need so many things? He says, well, you're a little young, you don't get life yet, but let me explain to you a couple of principles. And now he gets to the core of what he really wants to say. V'atabani, and now my son, in bina, shimazot. If you have wisdom, listen up. V'ateos nechal shema. Alam dechal lahoil b'Torah mitzvot. I want to teach you a principle in Torah mitzvot. And he says like this. Da ki adam nifal kafi pu'ulotav. Now you'll understand why I'm teaching you this today. I like the English here. A man is acted upon according to his actions. Before we said our head controls our actions, even our inner world. But our brain is powerful enough in order to control what's going on in the heart, what's going on in my desires. Here he wants to argue the other way around. It actually is what we do, right? It's not our brains which control what we do. What we do controls our inner world. A man is manipulated, is acted upon, is controlled by the way he behaves. That's why I call this rather than a cognitive approach, a behavioral approach. His heart. I don't know what you mean by the heart, but maybe he means our decision-making abilities, our inclinations, our choices. Maybe he means our inner urges, right? It's difficult to define what you mean when you say the word heart. His heart and all of his thoughts, tamid, always. It's quite a strong word. Whether it's good or bad. And even if you've got somebody who's very bad, let's say you've got a person who's really not a very nice person, and he's got no compunctions, ripping you off or stealing your wallet and whatever it might be, right? He is just always thinking about bad things. If that person will then decide to divert all of their time and energy to good things, Torah and mitzvot, even not for the best reasons, miyad yinateh el hatov. He will immediately turn to good. And when a person does it out of even without the top motivation, he will come to do it with pure motivation, and slowly he will get rid of his inclination to negative things. The hearts are drawn after the action. When I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about a few things. Sometimes you have, famous plays. George, what's his name? Bernard Shaw, the My Fair Lady, right? My Fair Lady. Can you take a market girl and dress her like an aristocratic and teach her how to speak? Will she blurt out, all sorts of obscenities, or will she actually become refined, right? By the way, this theory was also something which was investigated by psychologists after the Second World War. You might be aware during the 50s and 60s. I don't know if we've got any psychologists on the call. Maybe I should be careful using terms like cognitive and behavioral because there might be some. But having said that, you're probably aware of the experiments which were done about cognitive dissonance. A lot of experiments were done after the Second World War where scientists were trying to figure out how ordinary Germans could have become, brutal killers, and how, there were experiments done about causing pain to people and would people stop, all right? All sorts of, prison experiments and what have you to see was there innate cruelty in human beings. One of the experiments which was done was, I think, done by a guy called Festinger, and he investigated the question of cognitive dissonance. And what I mean by that is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the experiments he did was he asked people, let's say, to fold paper, do an inane task, to fold paper very accurately. Like imagine you fold it in half and then half again, or fold it in a triangle. And there were two groups. One group was doing it for free, and one group was paid, let's say, $50 an hour. So the students who were paid $50 an hour said, this is great. It's a great way to be able to pay my, my rent. And when they asked them, is there any use in this activity? They said, well, it's a pretty dumb activity, but they're paying me well. But then they went to the group who weren't being paid. And they said to them, well, is this a good activity or bad? And they had all sorts of explanations. They said, wow, no, this is really good. It's good motor control, and it helps my accuracy, and it's really helping my work in this, that, and the other. And Festinger came up to the conclusion that we don't tolerate, as human beings, cognitive dissonance. We don't want to feel that our actions are so far from who we are. And therefore, if we find ourselves doing something, we will always rationalize. All right. Somebody who's written more about rationalization is Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. I don't know if you read that one, but he's got an amazing, he's got an amazing piece where he talks about how we innately rationalize things, even to the point of lying. So he tells a story that his wife says to him in the morning, I'm going out to work. Can you please make sure you clean up the kitchen? And he's an author and he's trying to write. And of course he can't write. And he ends up all the day frustrated, not being able to write the article that he wants. And then his wife comes home at 5 o'clock in the evening and says, why is the kitchen a mess? And he goes, well, the dog was playing up and the kids and the this and the that. And he says, he was totally lying. He said, but where did that lie come from? I didn't even think about it. He said, I have such an instinct of self-defense, right? That even before I'd even thought, I'd come up with a lie. So interestingly enough, there are experiments which say that when you act a certain way, it will change your inner world, consciously or unconsciously, right? And you're actually affected by what you do. I think society sometimes, sometimes when somebody offends, they've done something, I don't know, some sort of social crime, and they'll tell somebody, well, you do 300 hours of community service, right? You did something, what's the idea of doing community service? So maybe something is like you've hurt the community, give back. But I think the sense is, well, if you work in a home for the elderly, you'll come to appreciate the elderly, and you won't do what you did before, which was like really hurting the elderly. I'm never quite sure this is such a great idea. If somebody's abused the elderly, then maybe you want to keep them away from old people. But okay, we can argue about whether it's sensible or not. But the theory behind it is that doing kind things will make you kinder. And this is what the Sefer Chinuch is saying. And he says it the other way around. He says, Vafilu imiyet tzadik gamor, ulvavoy yashar v'tamin. Even if you've got a perfectly righteous person, and he's a good individual, chafetz b'torah mitzvot, and he desires to do all sorts of good things. Again, uses the word tamid. If a person is forced to continually do awful things, Derech Mashal, he says, can you imagine? Let's say the king forced him into a particular, made him into his executioner. He made him do something wicked. He made him a torturer. If a person is really doing that all day, if you keep on doing something, it cannot but have an effect on you. You become blunted to the pain. You become blunted. It changes you. And whereas you were sensitive and kind and gentle before, you won't be, right? And you will become a rasha gamor. Ki yadua hadavar ve'emet. Shekol adam nifal k'fi pe'ulotav. People are affected by their actions. K'mo she'amarnu. V'alkein amru chachamim zichronom livracha. And therefore the rabbis say, Ratzah hamakom l'zakot Yisrael lefichach yirba lahem Torah u'mitzvot. And here we get to the core answer. Why does God give us so many mitzvot? Because he loves us. He wants us to be constantly in a network of good things. He wants us to be constantly in a framework of spirituality. It should fill our minds. It should be everything we do. And then it will make us better. So if we are always saying brachot, we will become more appreciative or more God-centered people. And if we have laws of financial caution, that will make us more sensitive about monetary matters, etc., etc. Because out of the good actions, we become better. And the rabbis hint to it when they say, anybody who is wearing tzitzit on his clothes and tefillin on his head and has a mezuzah on his door will not sin. Why do they say that? These are mitzvot which are continually with us. They have an effect. And now I'll take questions in a second, but I love this last paragraph. He says to his son, and since I said this, you might want to rethink, or you might want to think carefully about your career choices. He says, think about what you're going to, what job you're going to do. Because if you're a doctor, so you're going to heal people all day, right? But you might be somebody who is, I don't know, doing something which is really nasty, right? You might, I don't know, be putting parking tickets on cars, right? And that's not such fun, right? I don't know. I guess somebody putting parking tickets on cars could say, I'm there in order to ensure law abidingness in the city and to make sure that there is, I'm sure there's, and I guess motivation is relevant, but I don't know. Whichever way, I have my brother-in-law actually, after he had internalized this Sefer Chinuch, he actually was planning to go to business school, and he read this and heard various different teachings from different people about the way that your career and your daily work has an effect on you. And he said, you know what? I don't think I want to go to business school. I think I'm going to go and become a healer. And he became a physiotherapist, and he's one of Jerusalem's best physiotherapists, and people talk about him in the most glowing terms. But he said, I want to be in a caring profession. I don't want to be chasing the next, the bottom line and the balance sheet. So he says, be careful what you're going to put your work to, because they will affect you. You think that you will control yourself despite your profession? No, they will affect you. You will not affect them. And don't say, I'm a good person. You know what? Who do you think I am? Why can't I have a bit of fun like those people over there? I'll hang out at a bar here. I'll hang out in the marketplaces. And I'll talk like the common people. Say, well, they're just having fun. What's the problem? Hello, I'm a human being just like them. Who do I think I am? Why will they have an effect on me? Albany says the Chinuch, be very careful. Be careful about social influence, key and the behavioral influence. You're going to get caught in their trap. Many people say, yeah, it's nothing. And save your soul, young man. And he says, and after you know this now, don't find it difficult to understand why we have so many mitzvot. Yetziat Mitzrayim is such a foundational concept. He says, and the more we deal with it, the more it will have its effect on us, and therefore that's why there are so many things. So that's the Sefer Chinuch, and I think it is a very powerful thing. We can talk about thin cultures and thick cultures, and what the Chinuch is proposing is that Judaism is a very thick culture. We all know that a person can decide to, I don't know, keep Shabbat and not transgress anything of Shabbat, but not to wear special clothes, hang out with people who aren't necessarily observant, to not necessarily attend shul, not sing zmirot at the table, and they'll still won't have transgressed a thing of Shabbat, right? However, I think when a person, wears Shabbat clothes and sings the songs and, engages in the things which enhance Shabbat, each person according to their own style and fashion, Shabbat is thicker. Shabbat has its impact more. And I think that's what he's sort of trying to say, that, it can be that the idea of doing multiple things and piling on certain things can actually create a more impactful, impressionable religious experience. So essentially, if this is a course, if this is a class which is trying to ask ourselves, how we deal with our inner world, we've already spoken about joy and gratitude and all sorts of things like that. I find it fascinating that there are these two vectors. One which is saying our minds control what we want to be. And if we make that mental decision, it will shape ourselves. And that's option A. And then option B is saying, actually, our lifestyle controls what we are. And that's, of course, we control our lifestyle. But if you get into the wrong crowd or if you get into the wrong vibes, that can really make an impact on you. And therefore, our behavior is actually more critical in affecting our inner world. Is our mind over matter, or do our actions, as the Chinuch says, acharei ha'pulot nimshachim halevavot? Okay, so those are the two schools of thought that I wanted to present. And I want to sort of deepen them just a little bit. But again, this is a great point to pause a little bit for anybody's questions or comments or insights, anything anybody wants to share.
More of a comment. I'm just very impressed with how the Sefer HaChinuch weaves in quotations from Tanakh.
Yes.
And it's just been deeply amusing to see.
Like one of Ktani, Avami, Motnei Avi, that sort of thing. That's a great one.
Exactly.
Beautiful. By the way, that's also a feature, very big feature of the school of the Ramban. When you see the Ramban on the Torah, Ramban on Ala Torah, he is always paraphrasing a fragment of a verse here. And throughout Tanakh, the guy was baki. He had Tanakh running through his head, and his frames of reference and his dropping phrases from Tanakh is just stunning. So I assume that was sort of like it was a sort of a culture within the Bet Midrash that he created, and it filtered down. We don't quite know who wrote the Sefer Chinuch. There have been various speculations, but it filtered down to his students. Okay, I wanted to try and now take these two philosophies and show some other. After we did these, sometimes when I teach this, I just do these two sources, but I thought it would be fun to maybe talk a little bit about both these schools with some more modern commentators. And the first one I want to talk about is I'll start with the Chinuch and I'll go back to the Ibn Ezra. So this page is about the power of environment and atomic habits. I don't know if any of you have read the book Atomic Habits. I read it last Pesach, and it made a big impression on me. So I'll bring a little quote, but first let's just read a lovely passage from Rabbi Sachs, which again I love it. He says like this: walk into a shop, hand over a coin and buy a newspaper. No transaction could be simpler. You do it without thinking about it. Yet in this one event, you're living on the surface of a series of institutions that, if fully excavated, would tell half the story of mankind. The coin tells the long evolution of man from hunter-gatherer to city dweller, where specialization and division of labor led to the necessity of exchange, and thus a medium of exchange, and so eventually money, first as something valuable in itself, precious metals, and then as an abstract token. So he says, take that coin, and you've got the whole history of economics in front of you. Of course, Rabbi Sachs does, not necessarily you or me. He says, the newspaper speaks of a series of technological advances from writing to printing to the most modern forms of maintaining global communication. So first we have development of the alphabet and writing, and then printing, and then global communication. And it's part of a political history that gave us the idea in a free society that we're entitled to open access to information. So he says, you go, take a coin, buy a newspaper. Whoa, that's the tip of the iceberg. And look at that, what you have below the surface. And he says, to be a Jew is, on the face of it, to be involved in simple things. And then he goes into basically talk about mitzvot in the same way. In other words, what he says is that, let's say there's a mitzvah of kabed et tovicha v'timecha, or even a mitzvah of vishinantam levanecha. What's underneath that is a whole ethic of family, right? What is underneath, I don't know, the various mitzvot hatuluyot ba'aretz, or the idea that, I don't know, the second day chag in chutz la'aretz, or whatever it might be the centrality of the land of Israel. Right? There might be all sorts of rituals that we do, but when we really excavate them, our simple actions have within them, huge amount of spiritual DNA, if I want to put it that way. And by performing, and by the way, his argument is that Judaism is a very behavioral religion, but we don't quite realize quite how fundamentally, for example, Shabbat has given us a sense of, mental balance, emotional balance, a sense of our freedom, that nobody can rule us for Shabbat, right? We don't quite realize how, I don't know, the idea of Nasev and Ishma, the idea that the Jewish people have to accept the law, right, is so fundamental in Judaism that, it's not like God imposes the law on us. We freely took it on ourselves. And then the Talmud says, well, Nasev and Ishma wasn't enough. Maybe we were under duress. Oh, well, in the Megillah, Kimu v'Kiblu, right? The Jews chose to be Jewish. We didn't have it imposed on us. That guarantees human freedom, and so forth and so forth. And he'll say that all sorts of practices that we do, the idea of tzedakah, the idea of, the idea of Rosh Hashanah and forgiveness, right? So, there are other religions who, don't necessarily have those concepts so deeply embedded. And what he wants to claim is, what's the secret spell out of which you get this amazing, Judaism? He says, the culture of the Bet Midrash, the idea that you have machloket, the idea that you listen to each other, you have chavruta, the idea that different generations talk to one another. It gives the importance of asking questions, gives intellectual freedom, gives creativity. You're getting my point, right? So I think this very much jives with the Sefer Chinuch, where he's basically saying, we do things. We don't always understand why we do things. And we don't understand, we just know we've got to do them. But though that doing, somehow, if we have a moment to think, and even if we don't, actually fashions us in certain ways, right? So we can talk about a society where if I wasn't Jewish and I moved into a new, apartment in a new town, how would I get to know my neighbors? But the minute somebody moves into a Jewish neighborhood and attends the shul, suddenly they get invitations for Shabbat and they meet the people and suddenly they've got a whole network, right? That's an incredible community building thing, right? And that show, you get my point. So what I'm trying to say is that ethic, the notion that the actions contain within them values, and those values make an impact on our lives, is very much expressed here in a broader sense. And this is what I also saw through this James Clear's Atomic Habits. I'll just read a few lines. He says, if you're having trouble changing your habits, the problem isn't you. The problem is your system. Bad habits repeat themselves again and again, not because you don't want to change, but because you've got the wrong system for change. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems, right? And this is the importance of the system. I can want to change as much as possible, right? Focusing on the overall system rather than a single goal is one of the core themes of this book. It's also one of the deeper meanings behind the word atomic. By now, you've probably realized that an atomic habit refers to a tiny change, a marginal gain, a 1% improvement. But atomic habits are not just any old habits, however small. They're little habits that are part of a larger system, just as the atoms are part of building molecules. Atomic habits are the building blocks of a remarkable results. Habits are like the atoms of our life. Each one is a fundamental unit that contributes to your overall improvement. At first, these tiny routines seem insignificant, but soon they build on each other and fuel bigger wins that multiply to a degree that far outweighs the cost of their initial investment. They're both small and mighty, right? People, when I read this, I said, this is halacha, right? Why is it a problem to carry outside the Eruv? Why do I have to worry, if I take the ochel from the psolet or the psolet from the ochel, if I do borer, or if I squeeze that lemon onto food or I squeeze it into a glass. And halacha is so pedantic, but this is exactly the point. They're atomic habits. And these small changes make an impact. And this is the meaning of the phrase atomic habits, a regular practice or routine that is not only small and easy to do, but also the source of incredible power and component of the systems of compound growth. So in this regard, do, and then it will affect you. And here's a lovely example, which I brought from the book. Anne Thorndike, a primary care physician at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, had a crazy idea. She believed she could improve the eating habits of thousands of hospital staff and visitors without changing their willpower or motivation in the slightest way. In fact, she didn't plan on talking to them at all. Thorndike and her colleagues designed a 6-month study to alter the choice architecture of the hospital cafeteria. They started by changing how drinks were arranged in the room. Originally, the refrigerators located next to the cash registers in the cafeteria were filled with only soda. The researchers added water as an option to each one. Additionally, they placed baskets of bottled water next to food stations throughout the room. Soda was still primarily in the primary refrigerators, but water is now available at all drink locations. Wait for it. Over the next 3 months, the number of soda sales at the hospital dropped by 11.4%. Meanwhile, the sales of bottled water increased by 25.8%. They made similar adjustments and saw the similar results with food in the cafeteria. Nobody had said a word to anyone eating there. The architecture, right? So I come back to the Sefer Chinuch. Sometimes our actions affect us more than we are willing to realize, or maybe we are willing to realize, but acharei hapu'ulot nishachim halvavot. Our decisions are affected by our lifestyle and our habits, our inclinations are about what's available and are about what is going on around us. Sometimes societal pressure, sometimes food architecture, right? They say if you don't want to eat chocolate, so don't buy it when you go to the supermarket, and then it's not in the closet, right? There's some truth in that. So that's theory number one. But theory number two, well, that was actually theory number two. That was the Sefer Chinuch. But let's go back to the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra had a different theory, and Ibn Ezra said, well, you know what? It's all about making decisions. And here I wanted to bring another set of sources. And here you will see the Rambam's famous advocacy of free will and the power of mind over matter. So he says here, Reshut kol adam netunah lo. Every person is endowed with free will. If he desires to bend himself toward the good path and to be just, it's within the power of his hand to reach it. If he desires to bend himself to a bad path and to be wicked, it's within the power of his hand to reach out for it. Right? He says, Im ratzah lahator atzmo lederech tova, liot tzadik, harashut biyado. Im ratzah lahator atzmo lederech ra'ah, liot rasha, harashut biyado. And he quotes from Bereshit, right? The story of the Garden of Eden. Heina adam haya kechad mamenu ledat tov v'ra. Human beings have the choice, good and evil, right? And he says, and that's a unique human trait, right? He says, behold, the species, man, humankind, stands alone in the world, and there's no other like him, as regards this subject being able of his own accord, by his reason and thought, to know good and evil, and to do whatever his inclination dictates with him, none to stay his hand from either doing good or evil. And being that he is so, etc., etc. So in other words, for the Rambam, like the Chinuch, right? You make a decision, it's up to you, right? And if I just go a little bit, he says, Al yavor b'machshavtecha davar zeh she'omrim tipshei umot v'rov golmei b'nei Israel. Don't allow yourself to think what the fools of the nations and the idiots of the Bnei Israel say. Shakadosh Baruch Hu gozer al adam mitchilat b'yato liot tzadik or rasha. That God has a fate for you, and you're either destined to be a tzaddik or a rasha, a righteous person or a evil person. I love that. You can be like Moses. Or Rashak Yeravam. You can be as bad as Yeravam, Chacham or Sachal. Right? You can be, either wise or you can be foolish, or Rahman or Achzari. You can be cruel, you can be kind. All those things. Nobody is going to force you. It's all up to you. Right? All up to you. This is the Rambam. It's in the middle of Hilchot Shuvah. It's the central chapter of the Book of Repentance where he says, you're the one who decides. Rabbi Sachs, again, I'm bringing him for both sides, has lovely ways of saying this. He says, for as long as we have documentary evidence, human beings are attributing their misfortunes to factors other than human will and the responsible self. They still do today. Right? It's what Adam and Eve do in Garden of Eden. Right? Eve says, Adam says, Eve made me, and Eve says, the snake made me. Right? And in the past, men blamed the stars, their fates, the furies, the gods. Today, they blame their parents. My kids certainly do. Their environment, their genes, the educational system, the media, the politicians, and when all else fails, the Jews. And he says, we live in an age of, please, sir, it wasn't me. Marx said that human behavior is determined by economic factors such as ownership of land. Therefore, God said to Avram, leave your land. Spinoza said that conduct is driven by instincts given at birth. Therefore, God said to Abraham, leave your birthplace. Freud said that we're influenced by our relationship with our father. Therefore, God said to Abraham, leave your father's house. Liberty is not a given of the human situation. Like other distinctive achievements of the spirit, art, literature, and music, poetry, in these training, discipline, apprenticeship, and the most demanding routines, and the most painstaking attention to detail, etc., etc. I'm not going to carry on reading, but I'm just going to say, what Rabbi Sachs is saying is we claim that there are other factors to bear, but it's up to us. Put in the work, put in the perspiration, put in the elbow grease, however you're going to say it, and you can be what you want to be. Don't blame your genes. Don't blame your relationship with your parents. Don't blame your country. Lech lecha me'artzecha moladetcha beit avicha. Lech lecha. Go and be you. Very powerful centrality of human will. Like the Ibn Ezra said. And I'll just finish with this from the Masechet Yuma, where they say the rabbis taught the poor, the rich, the sinner come before the heavenly court. And they each get asked the question, you should have learned more Torah, right? So the poor person says, what do you mean? I was making a living. They tell the story of Hillel. Hillel, who was so poor that he couldn't afford even the money to pay his way into the Bet Midrash. He climbed on the roof to listen. Snow fell on him and he almost died. But that was Hillel. Your poverty isn't a reason not to learn Torah. Then the rich person comes and they said, why aren't you learning Torah? And he says, well, you know what? I've got a big business to run, so I can't learn Torah, right? This is a Gemara about excuses. And so he says, well, you're any richer than Rabbi Elazar, and they talk about his fleets of boats and all that sort of stuff. And he learned Torah. And then they go to the Rasha and they say to the evil person, why didn't you learn more Torah? And he says, well, yeah, I'm fighting my Yetzer Hara all day. It's very, very exhausting. And they said, well, are you any more beautiful than Joseph? Did you have more temptations than Joseph with Potiphar's wife? And yet he remained on the straight and narrow, and therefore you can too. And again, this is a question about excuses or being essentially in the driving seat. Though the example of Hillel condemns the poor, Rabbi Elazar ben Charsam condemns the rich, and Joseph the virtuous condemns the sensual. Essentially, this is what I was trying to sort of share with you today. Is this? Stacy asked, where was the last Rabbi Sachs from? It was on an article on Lech Lecha. So if you look on Lech Lecha, you'll find it in one of his articles there, if I'm not mistaken. 1 second, let me just check the source sheet again. See if I can find the source. Hold on. Yeah, I put the URL on the sheets. It's on page 4. It's called Lech Lecha, The Long Walk to Freedom. So the so essentially what I try to do today, one, if we're dealing with our personality traits and our habits of the heart, what I tried to do today was to give you these two models. Obviously, there's not one model which is right. I know that you could argue they're contradictory. One says, you're in control, and the other one says, no, your actions control you. And this is obviously not a binary answer. Obviously, there are multiple dynamics going on at any one given time with all of us. And I think as we're more aware of these dynamics and we're more mindful of them, we are more able to we're more able to be able to, you know, to be intelligent about them and to have the ability to be able to think that if there are things we want to change, to think about, like, is this something which I can just conquer through my willpower? Or do I need to think about changing my environment or the social or other environmental factors which are, making this so available for me? Um, and I just wanted to sort of like, put this roadmap in front of us. Um, and I think it's just interesting to hear our rabbi so aware of human psychology. Um, and that's it for today.
Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Rabbi Israel, for teaching today. If you would like to join Risha for more Torah this week, coming up on Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Dr. Han Gafni will be teaching discussions on the Parsha, Risha's Parsha Tashavu Ashir, with a rotating group. Otherwise, I hope to see you and learn with you all next week. Take care and have a good day.